Welcome to the Damascus Encounter, your interesting TV program where we share interesting and insightful stories about children of God whose lives took dramatic turns after they encountered Jesus. On the program today, I have a special child of God, someone who, by all standards, you would love to listen to. He is by name Professor Kelvin Onuoha. Professor Kelvin Onuoha is a child of God. He is a preacher. He is a pastor. He is a professor. And currently he is the professor and vice chancellor of the Adventist Central University in Rwanda. Pastor Kelvin Onuoha, you are welcome to the Damascus Encounter.
Thank you, Femi. It's a pleasure being here.
Yeah. So let's start this way by having a little bit into your early childhood, growing up, and the plans you had growing up.
I was born in Lagos and grew up in the barracks. I come from a military background, by the way.
Okay.
My grandfather, from my mother's side, was a soldier.
Okay.
My father found my mother in the barracks, got married to her.
Wow.
And then I had an uncle who later became a general and a prominent person. He also was in the military. My eldest sister got married to an officer in the army.
Wow.
My brother became a naval officer. He died many years ago. And so I come from a military background.
Oh, yeah.
And then from that military background, you would think that naturally I would gravitate in that direction.
Something like that.
No, my father never encouraged any one of us to go into the military. He had this impression that you need to find your own course. You need to go to where you had a passion for. He believed you didn't have to take orders from someone who was not as competent as you are. Because in the military, the dictum is orders is orders. You're not allowed to think. You just carry out orders. And so he didn't quite encourage us to go into the military. So I grew up thinking, I would like to be a doctor. So that's how I grew up in that context.
Okay, so the dream to be a doctor. And so, talking about childhood experiences, the dream of the vision of wanting to be a doctor, let's a little hint on your educational background, schools that you went to, and what you studied in school.
Primary school. We were the ones who started, the Army started a project in which they were now going to have their own schools, primary school,
Okay.
and then later they got to the secondary school. And of course, NDA came later as a university. So I joined the Command Children's School in its nascent stage. This was in Ann Barracks in Yaba area, not too far from Queen's College. That's where I started my primary school, grew up there. And then secondary school was St. Gregory's College, Obalende, Lagos. And after that, there was a hiatus before I later got into the University of Benin with the hope and the plan I would do medicine. But JAM didn't allow that, so I wound up getting an admission to geology. So, but that's the background.
Okay, so for first degrees you had, you studied geology.
Actually, the first degree was not completed. While at the University of Benin, I had an experience that forced me to choose between whether I would stay there and take exams on the Sabbath, or whether I would do something radical, and which led to my doing only half of the program at the University of Benin before I found my way to the campus of ASWA, which later became Babcock University.
Okay, so that radical decision, I mean, having to leave, it was all about the Sabbath exams. You didn't want to write exams on Sabbath.
Okay. You asked about my background. My mother was Catholic. My father was Anglican, because in the military they only recognized two religions, two faith traditions, which is you either Catholic or you were Protestants.
Okay, so was that peculiar? Sorry to butt in. That's peculiar to Nigeria, or?
Yes, peculiar to Nigeria.
Okay.
In Ghana, you have Adventists who are chaplains, but in the context of Nigeria, that is not even a possibility, at least for now. So, I got baptized, christened as a Catholic, had a name then. And so this is the context in which I grew up, in which I came from a non-Adventist background. However, while in St. Gregory's College, after my first year there, my father was transferred to the north, to Kaduna, and so I had to move into the boarding house of St. Gregory's College.
Yeah.
And so I stayed in the boarding house, I think, for the first 3 years, and then we had Lateef Jakonde, who became the governor of Lagos State, and came up with this idea that schools, exclusive schools like St. Gregory's College, should be for everybody. And they shut down the boarding house system and made it a day school for everyone to come. Now that affected me because I now needed to become a day student. And it was then I had the opportunity, which was providential, to stay with a family friend who was very close to us, also with a military background. And their house was at Mende, close to Maryland bus stop, facing the headquarters of the Seventh Adventist Church in Nigeria.
Wow, quite interesting. So, as a young boy growing up, your experience with God, how early did you start experiencing God?
Not early. It's always interesting to meet folks who, you know, from the age 3, I always knew I was going to be a preacher. No, that wasn't my experience at all. Indeed, I don't have childhood experiences relating to God that I'll say I was proud of, because back then, we're the folks, I don't know whether I should say this on camera.
Please go ahead.
Well, we're the folks who were given money to return in church, you know, a parent to give us money, drop this for the offering, and offerings. Sometimes it wound up being money we used to buy sweets.
And ice creams. Yeah, I know what that feels like. I know what that feels like.
So it wasn't back then, it wasn't that early that I began to have those feelings. But I think when I did wind up in a Catholic secondary school, by the way, St. Gregory's College, I know that I was religious, I prayed often, but I think things took a radical turn when I lost my mother in my 3rd year in that process, and it affected me, I got to realize later, more than I ever imagined. I did pray to God before then, but I think the loss of my mother, who was like the center of my world, coming up from a polygamous family, affected me tremendously. But then I got to stay with a family who had a little Adventist connection. Now, the head of that home had grown up somewhere close to Jingri. And so he had attended the Seventh Adventist primary school in his area. So he had an Adventist connection. And so when now he was living in Mende area in Maryland, elders of the Adventist church reached out to do Bible study in that house, and I was there. And so that's how I got to begin to study the truths about the Adventist message at that time, but did not get baptized.
Okay. Now, in terms of the dreams you had and what you wanted to be in life, a medical doctor, get to the university and all, what have you, how much of parental influence came into the choice and
of
then,
a career?
Exactly.
Not much, I would say, but I can't quite explain where the desire to be a medical doctor came from. But I guess back then, you either were a doctor or a lawyer or an engineer or something. Exactly. So I was good in the science. I did the sciences. So I said, okay, I think I would like to be a doctor, but not as if I had a strong motivation back then. And but when I did, I think I'm leaving out quite a significant part. Okay, so let me piggyback a bit. Now, staying in the Adventist home, studying the scripture, getting to know what the Sabbath was all about, helped me, but I wasn't ready quite at that time to make the decision to become an Adventist. Did I tell you that the first time I saw the name, the Seventh Adventist Church, was when I got down from a bus at Maryland bus stop, looked across the road, saw this edifice, Seventh Adventist Church, and I said, wow, this is really the last days that they told us about. Can you imagine? Is that a church? I mean, we know Catholic Church, Anglican Church. What is Seventh-day Adventist Church? And never could I have imagined in my wildest imaginations I would not only become a member of that church, but also pastor of that church. So, but I did do the Bible study there, but then went back to join my family in Kaduna. And by this time, I did not walk with God. I left the intense study of the Word of God until a couple of years went by. And that is when I think the stirring began. Because one day, I knelt down in my room and prayed to God and said, Lord, I'm not quite satisfied with the way my life is going. I want something more than what I'm doing. Going out with friends, partying, and doing things that will not make me pleased, things I know are not quite right. And I knelt down and made that prayer. And I tell you, Femi, a week later, less than a week later, God revealed himself in powerful ways that made the trajectory of my life to become transformed completely.
So if we would couch it, then we can say that was your Damascus encounter.
Precisely.
And,
precisely.
You now decided, you know what, I'll just go all the way.
You know, when I knelt down and I prayed, I said, Lord, I want you to do something in my life. I want to get out of this pit or cesspool I find myself. And I remember ending the prayer with, just do this for me. I'll be ready to do whatever you want. And maybe I shouldn't have added that clause later.
Well, maybe you had conscience, because sometimes we say that and it happens, and then we're still looking for some other ways. I'm not sure. Did I really say that? Maybe not now, and stuff like that. So basically, you said the prayers, God answered the prayers, and you felt the urge to move on. So that being the Damascus encounter and experience, we'll come back to talk some more on how God has led you ever since you took that decision. Don't go away, we'll be back in a very short while. Welcome back to the Damascus Encounter. On the program today, we've had Professor Kelvin Onuoha, who has been sharing his experience, how he encountered Jesus, and then his life took another turn, a different way completely, from having studied medicine and coming to become a pastor. So, Professor Kelvin, Pastor Kelvin, share with us a little bit how, when that experience, you prayed and God heard the prayers, and then you decided, anything I would do. When you shared this with your dad, what was the reaction?
Actually, my dad wasn't in the picture at that time. I didn't really have an influence at that time. But this is what happened. Like I said, my life had kind of come to a pause, a standstill. But immediately after I made that prayer, I was able to get back into school, did a receipt of my exams. I went to Ibadan Boys High School, and within 3 months of my life, I'd been able to get my, do the JAMB all over again, get my school certificate exams taken. 5 months later, I had the results I needed to get me admission. 6 months later, I'd gotten admission into the University of Benin. And so when I got there, of course, medicine being very competitive, they said, well, we don't have the space here, or wish you had a little higher score. So, but if you'd like to do something in the sciences, would you like to do biology, geology? I said, okay, I'll do geology. So got admitted into the program in geology. But about that same time, my journey, my walk with God had become transformed. I realized God was working, God was real, God was powerful. And I was praying to God and studying His Word. And while I was back in Ibadan, I looked for the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Okay. And God used a family that was in the same premises where I was staying with my elder sister to lead me to the church at Okebola, a church you should know.
Interesting. I know that place, yeah.
And so I got there and started going there every Sabbath to worship. And that's how it was. So I determined, look, I was going to hold fast to God. And then, like I said, a few months later, got the admission, and I realized, look, God had radically transformed my life, and I needed to hold fast to Him. And so I looked for the Seventh Adventist Church in Benin, went to the pastor and told him I'd like to get baptized. Guess who the pastor was?
Oh.
Pastor Omije.
Wow.
Yeah. Went to him and said, I would like to get baptized. And he saw this young man who came to him wanting to get baptized. Said, well, let me study the Bible with you. So we started the Bible study. And then just about the time we were to have a matriculation ceremony into the University of Benin. I'd picked up my gown, got it pressed, told my aunt I was staying with, this is my matriculation day. I went to church on Friday for the Vesper service, and the pastor looked for me and ran excitedly. I have good news for you. There's a baptism taking place tomorrow, and I would like you to be one of them. I said, okay. So he took me to the pastor, Pastor Chima, at that time the conference president, and he conducted an interview with us, and then said, listen, so what are you doing, young man? I told him. And so he said, I hope you understand that now that you're planning to get baptized, you understand what it means regarding observing the Sabbath and not taking exams on the Sabbath. And so I said, okay, took the vow. Now I had a critical decision to make on Sabbath. I had my matriculation robe pressed, my suit ready, everything was set. The question was, where would I go? Matriculation to the university, or I remember mentioning this to Pastor Chima, and he said, well, you actually have a choice to make, whether you're going to matriculate into the university or matriculate into heaven. Wow.
That was his response.
That was his response. So the next morning, my aunt was excited that she was going to go with me to matriculation. I told her I wasn't going. I went to church. And she thought I was crazy. So that's how I got baptized on that day, which was supposed to have been my matriculation day, January 12, 1985. And so I didn't understand the significance of that until a couple of years later.
Yeah, but just for information's sake and clarity, she thought you must have been crazy. What happened to you? And after, but you went to church anyways. When you got back, what was the discussion about?
She just felt, look, this guy is on his own. By the way, this aunt of mine was actually a very close family friend, a business associate of my mother, who kind of like became a surrogate mother, a proxy mother to me after I lost my mother. But the reason she couldn't talk much, I think, was because when I was seeking admission, she tried to use her political connection, and she was a powerhouse in politics in that city of Benin. Tried to use her political clout to get me admitted, and she came back one day and said, sorry, but the professor who was supposed to help said it won't be possible. So, but I remember telling her back then, I said, I will get that admission. And she, infuriated, said, are you a magician? And I said to myself, no, but I know one who is greater than a magician. And I prayed to God and followed that up, and I got that admission. So now I got admission without her help. I could choose to follow the God who helped me get the admission. So that's what happened. So got in, started the program, but then I was having exams on Sabbath. The first year I had exams on Sabbath, prayed about it. Something mysterious happened, exams got changed, I was able to do that. But in my second year, it became almost impossible. And then I realized that this would not end. I needed to do something
about it.
I heard about ASWA and came down over here, inquired, and eventually got a transfer to ASWA, and I thought, okay, maybe I could now go back to my medical program I wanted to do.
Okay.
So I did a program in religion with a biology minor. That's what I did when I got to ASWA back then.
That's interesting. So ASWA, Adventist Seminary of West Africa.
Africa.
So eventually you graduated, obviously, and you became a pastor, served in the field. A little bit about your experience pastoring, becoming a conference mission president.
Before we get to the to that part, let me clarify something. When I came to ASWA, I had no intentions of becoming a pastor.
A pastor. Oh, okay. That's interesting.
I wanted simply to get a degree and perhaps go back to do medicine, which I thought I wanted to do. But then God led through different pathways while I was here. And I went through very rough times financially. Indeed, when I got here, I had no sponsor. But God got me registered for my first quarter. And I don't know how the school fees came about. And the second quarter, I had the women's ministries of the conference at that time who did something. I was able to stay in school. But this happened for some time, and then I realized, look, I needed a more stable source of finance.
Source of income.
And when I went canvassing, which is selling student literature as a student literature evangelist, I spent 1 year in Cameroon. I thought I would spend 3 months. I thought I should stay longer and then make enough money to go transfer to Caribbean Union College, which was a passport to the US, where I could, and Caribbean Union College was just about $1,500 US. So I thought I could use that pathway to get to the States and continue studying medicine. 1 year in Cameroon led me to greater poverty than before I got there.
Wow.
So after
eventually,
this, I realized things can't be this way. 1 year out of school, managed to get back, and that is when I got support from the Edo Delta Conference, what later became Edo Delta Conference. It was Edo Delta Mission at that time. And I remember they decided to sponsor me. And when I asked a friend of mine, what does this mean? He said, well, it means you may have to work for the number of years that you were sponsored. So the point I'm making here, FM, is there are folks who had the Damascus experience, like Paul, who came out and knew, this is what I want to do.
Certainly, yeah.
Mine was more like the Jonas experience, where I was running away from God.
And then you ran into that same plan that God...
I ran into God's plan. And so I often tell folks as a minister, I said, I can spot a Jonas as far as 1 kilometer away. I can know when you're running, and I can tell you, look, I've been there, done that.
So interesting story. And so obviously, to the glory of God, up till now, today, you are still a pastor, minister of the gospel. But then let's talk a little bit, because time is running out, your experience as a minister of the gospel, but now as an academician. You are Vice Chancellor of the
Adventist University
of Central Africa. So a little bit about that and what God is doing.
Yeah, this came sometime last year. I was approached to take up the responsibility at this University Beautiful campus in Kigali, Rwanda, and accepted it as a direction from God in which I felt this was something to do. So it's been a wonderful experience since then.
Okay. So challenges?
Many challenges, because I took on this new calling about the period of the pandemic and got to a campus where we had financial challenges because the pandemic had ravaged our resources. And then the lockdown, we had a lockdown. Of course, there was a global lockdown from March for several months across the world, but the country of Rwanda takes the pandemic more seriously than most countries in the world. And so we thought we'll be locked down for like 6 months, and this turned out to be a much longer period. So we got in to a campus that was struggling with how to hold on to staff when there was no income, and yet you had to, and there was so much still going out as outcome. So that is how it was. But we're grateful to God that despite the pandemic, we've been able to keep the doors of the university open, maintain an enrollment, carry out our programs, and we give God the praise for everything.
Interesting. So, in a nutshell, when you look back, a kind of word of advice for young coming students, pastors who are about to engage in ministry, and then you think about the journey, how difficult it could be, the circumstances around, what would you advise? How you hold on, trust in God, walk in the pathway, realizing that there is a call. You answered.
Yeah, I think we've got to be open to the leading of God. We've got to be sensitive to the directions that God wants to take. Providence will lead us in pathways we never thought, planned, or imagined that we would take. And it's always interesting to look back later and see how God has led. You know, we say 2020 vision is perfect, but with God, you never would imagine the pathways that he would lead. If someone had told me 30 years ago, this is where you would be and this is what you'd be doing, I would have said, nah. Indeed, I became a professor, but I hated teaching. The thought of holding a chalk never crossed my mind at all. Yeah. But then I'm happy that we changed from chalk. to markers.
Interesting.
And it's often interesting to hear students, oh, we're so blessed by how you taught. Because I said, listen, I never wanted to do that.
So interesting. Thank you very much for sharing your story, Professor Kelvin Onuoha. It's a blessing having you in the house. And I want to pray and believe that many out there will be blessed having listened to your story. That will be it on today's edition of the program, Damascus Encounter. Thanking God for a beautiful story that we have had. Same time next week, we'll be back with another exciting and interesting story of conversion experience and God leading to where he wants his child to be. Until then, have a beautiful time and do encounter Jesus.